Hello everybody and welcome back to the Fearless Training Raw Knowledge podcast with myself, Alex Connor, and Christmas is almost upon us. If you're listening to this podcast, it's just a few days away. So I just want to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas. I hope everyone is all prepared and ready. Let's face it, probably not. No one is. But more to the point, if this is a holiday that you celebrate, enjoy it, spend time with family, friends, loved ones. Keep it simple. It's not really about the gifts. If anything, it's just a little bit of time to perhaps gather one's thoughts and hopefully have a bit of time to yourself, and again, time with the important people in your life, whoever they may be. However, the show must go on, and we are going to continue on here. We're going to continue delivering the goods as often and as consistently as possible. And today, I've got another very talented guest. Those of you may know his name. I'm sure a lot of you will. His name is Cliff Wilson. Now, Cliff is renowned for his conditioning, and his conditioning not only gets himself into, but also his athletes into. So a little bit about Cliff and a bit of background for those of you who may not be aware. He is a professional natural bodybuilder, and he's one of the top physique coaches in the industry. Now, he founded his company Team Wilson in 2010 using a combination of scientifically proven methods and experience-driven techniques. And we'll get into the weeds of that today, very much so. We're taking a very in-depth approach, and we're very much a deep dive in this episode in terms of looking at a comp prep specific approach, and also looking at all of the gray areas, the idiosyncrasies within it as well. As of 2019, the team has amassed over 150 pro cards, 85 pro titles, and 13 world championships. So Cliff works both with tested and untested athletes, which is something, again, that I'm very curious about in terms of the approach and what the differentials are and the considerations and the recommendations with which we talk about within this episode. So for those of you who are perhaps on either side, but also are wondering what are the differences, definitely something to listen in for within this episode, and also different groups and demographics as well, which I found extremely interesting and insightful. His clientele ranges from first-time competitors to world-class professionals. His goal as a coach is really simple, and it's to help every athlete achieve their ultimate potential regardless of their current level. So Cliff is also published author in Bodybuilding, the Complete Contest Preparation Handbook, and of numerous articles online and in print. He also co-owns the Physique Summit, where he speaks annually. He has also spoken in Singapore, the UK, Greece, and across the US. So he's very well versed. He's got a lot of hands-on experience, which you will learn very shortly in this podcast. And I think one of the most unique things about Cliff is that, again, he starts from that sort of anecdotal perspective and then looks at drawing trends and data and sort of keystone habits, if you will, and then looks to back them up with the science. And now he's obviously got a combination and a plethora of experience, which he's able to apply for devastating effect in a very positive way. So, guys, for those of you who are thinking about competing, for those of you who have competed, for those coaches, for those clients out there, for those of you who are really interested in the science and the in-depth look at comp preparation, this is the episode for you. And if you're not already, make sure you go over and give Cliff a follow. His content is phenomenal, and he will really go into a lot of the, idiosyncrasies and the specifics of comp preparation, some of which may surprise you. A side note as well, guys, I had a little bit of hay fever on this episode too, and I was struggling a little bit. I was doing my best to keep it all retained. However, there's a few sniffles from myself, so I do apologize. Please hang in there. There's not many, but if you're wondering what that strange noise is, it's me trying to clear my sinuses. So I do apologize, but apart from that, you will have no interruptions. So guys, without further ado, thank you again for your support, and enjoy my conversation this week with Cliff Wilson. Cliff, welcome to the Raw Knowledge podcast, and thank you for your time. It's in the Gold Coast here. We're really hot in this part of the world. I believe you're in Chicago. Is that right? Can you give us some context to the
Yeah, I
weather over
appreciate you
where
having
you're
me
at?
on, and it is freezing here. So we are complete opposite. It's like 5 degrees here.
There we go. All ready for a true white Christmas, I imagine.
Yes, yeah, it was literally snowing today. So yeah, so I wish I was in your shoes and it was really hot here.
The grass is always greener on the other side, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
All right.
No,
Well,
I'm looking forward to it.
no, fantastic, man. It's going to be good. And I know your name will be well recognized by a lot of the viewers and the listeners. However, for people who are not familiar, as always, can you give us a bit of a background and a bit of context to who you are, what you do, what you're passionate about, and perhaps why before we dig into some interesting topics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for myself, I'm a professional natural bodybuilder. One thing I always tell people is that I'm a pretty average professional natural bodybuilder. I'm much more well known for coaching. I'm one of those lucky people that I coach physique athletes, not just bodybuilders, but bikini, figure, men's physique, all of it, full time. I don't even work with general population. And so I get to work with just what I'm passionate about, which is physique competition. And so, I've been doing this, believe it or not, for almost 10 years now. Time really flies. And, over the course of that time, I've been pretty lucky to work with some really great athletes. In that 10 years, I've coached, quite a few world natural champions. And also helped a lot of people get their pro cards, and both on the natural side and the enhanced side. So I kind of pride myself on being able to. What I always say is I pride myself on being able to work with anybody, any division, male, female, whatever it may be. I pride myself on being able to figure out what that person needs to be at their best and make it happen.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's something that makes you very diverse and, very malleable. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to discuss today, Cliff, about talking, the discrepancies between perhaps the natural and the unnatural, and what really are the big differences, and looking at the mechanisms and perhaps the approaches as well. But I guess before we get into all that, I know that a big name that comes to mind, where people, may know you from, or someone that's kind of put you on the map, is Doug Miller. We look at Doug Miller's physique and wow, right? One of the best natural bodybuilders in the world. And again, I know that it was an interesting, when he reached out to you and you started coaching him, etc. So I guess as a digression of that, how did you stumble, or how did you, get to the position where you are, like you said, able to just coach within your niche? You're very specific and you get to do exactly what you love every day and work with the, the athletes that you want to work with.
Yeah, so it actually didn't start out like that. So I actually was, when I first started coaching, I mean, I was a bodybuilder myself before I ever coached. And what happened was there were a couple of guys at my gym, and they wanted to do a bodybuilding show. Now, I was like, this is the worst, but I was that guy that started coaching people after doing one show. I wasn't charging them, but I wasn't charging them, and I didn't really know if I should be coaching people, but I guess what I knew is that I knew more than they did. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I could prevent them from doing stupid things that I had maybe done. And at that point in my career, I had done quite a bit of studying. Unlike a lot of people that have been pretty successful in the coaching arena, I was self-educated, but I took a very scientific approach. I would subscribe to scientific journals so I could read the studies myself. And so I actually think in some regards, now this is not a don't go to school advertisement, but I think in some regards not having the formal education caused me to maybe not think in quite the same way and in the same linear path that a lot of others have. So I kind of started with the approach of let's see what's working in real life, and then find the research that correlates with what's working in real life. So anyway, I started with that, and my first competitor I ever put on stage won Mr. Natural Illinois. And as he won, and I had more people, start asking me, and I had a string of good luck at the beginning, because there is a lot of luck that goes into winning bodybuilding shows. But I think it was like 8 of the first 9 shows I had clients in, I had an overall title at those. And so it was just, things took off really, really fast. and I had a lot of success in those first 3 years in particular. And then Doug reached out because it wasn't just the track record that I think Doug reached out to me to work with me, but it was also the fact that I was doing a lot of things differently than what other people were doing back in 2014. And he and I knew each other already because he had sponsored me. I was like one of their first sponsored athletes at his company, Core Nutritionals.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to be friends, and I got to coach him going into his shows, and he won all 3 of them, and he won the world championships that year. And then it was kind of, obviously, just the coaching progression has been pretty on an uptrend ever since. So it's been great. I love it. And but to go back to also what you were saying is how I got to be just coaching bodybuilders. So I actually did start coaching some general population in the early years of my coaching career, but I found out I was horrible at it. I think I'd be better with it now. Like, this was like, 8-9 years ago. But my nature tends to be more extreme. If you follow me on social media and follow my posts, I tend to take everything to their ultimate extreme.
Yes.
And, I also tend to be a pretty straightforward coach. Like, I'm not like a coach that's going to yell at my clients or anything, but I'm always going to tell people like it is. And I realize general population does not want to hear it like it is. They want things softened, and I generally don't tend to soften. I think I'd be better at it now, but back then it wasn't good. Like I was just bad with general population. So I think the things that make me great with physique athletes, and I've worked with actually a couple other athletes in other sports. Like I do work with powerlifters, and I've worked with even a few fighters. So my extreme nature works well towards athletics, but it's horrible for general population.
Yeah, there's a couple of good points I just want to pick up there. I mean, I guess you're right that first point that what you just touched on. Yeah, there is a digression between coaching, athletes and general population. I think there's a big misconception there in and of itself where, you get a lot of people who are qualified, a lot of PTs, whatever qualification, wherever you are around the world. You generally come straight out. There's obviously a large interest in people who want to coach people to look better than the average, to jump on stage. You get the general population clients. You try to almost have those similar approaches, and it's too razor sharp. It's too acute. It's too aggressive, and you get a lot of pushback. And it's something I think a lot of listeners can relate to as well, in being that sometimes this, and quote unquote, kind of hate to use the term the general pop, because sometimes we all start off as general population before we even know to a degree that we love something, which is quite interesting. And then to go back, I'd like to ask a question from a coach's standpoint here, because you said you didn't want to be that guy, you competed, and we all know that person, and some people really shouldn't, because they have not perhaps done it even slightly intelligently, shall we put it, and then they advertise comp prep and all this and that, but you've got to start somewhere. So I guess for the coaches listening, where do you start? Or now with, that experience that you have, if you're a coach, where would you start if you did have an interest in, coaching, obviously, physique clients and bodybuilders? Now, I imagine that you definitely, I believe, practice what you preach, do a show, familiarize yourself with the, the protocols, the procedures, the setups. But what advice would you give, I guess, if you could sort of speak to your younger self about trying to, progress and sort of, diffuse into that more niche market? Would you give any pointers for coaches out there who want to sort of get into that space?
Yeah. Now this may sound, it's been very interesting over the last 10 years to see the progression of how physique sports in general have evolved. I at least for myself, a lot of all of my business growth, we'll say, like, clients approaching me, came entirely from results. I didn't do any advertising. I was, as we were talking before we started recording here, I was telling you how just technology, I'm like always behind. And so when it comes to like social media, I was late to Facebook, late to Instagram, and generally I was just results focused. And I still think like a lot of people don't go that route today. Like they go right to Instagram and stuff like that. And so I think one of the problems today that I see with like you said, that guy that starts coaching after only doing one show or no shows, is that a lot of times there's this presentation of propping yourself up as something you're not. if that makes sense.
Yes.
Like people decide I'm opening my coaching services, so I need to present this front to the bodybuilding, the fitness world that I am this knows everything expert. And they're like putting out content and asking me questions, and I know it all, and I'm the guy that you come to. I didn't particularly do that. I was just like, I didn't put out a lot of content in the early days. I would say, here's my client, this is what he looks like, this is what I've done with him. I didn't necessarily say, this is what you need to do, this is what I've done. I think there is a big problem right now of coaches and influencers telling everybody what they should be doing, when in actuality I don't think a lot of people know what anybody needs to be doing because it's so individual. So I guess what I would say, if you want to get into that space, even find one person that'll trust you, that you maybe can help, that you know more than, and make the most with that person. Because if you do good work with that person, they're going to probably tell everybody. If they're happy with what you've done with them, they're going to tell everybody, and then maybe you'll get another one, and then you can build it up from there and build that person. I think one person that comes to mind with this now is my friend Peter Fitchen. Now, Peter Fitchen has his PhD, so he's super educated, like complete opposite route. But one thing I'm going to talk about with Pete is that we wrote a book together recently, and Pete, though, doesn't have this massive social media following. I think he has maybe 2,000 or 3,000 followers on Instagram, and but he has a full roster every year because he does really good work with his clients, and they go out and they tell everybody. And so he gets, this person that heard it from that person, and they just keep coming, and, he doesn't need the social media. So I think if you're trying to get into that space, focus on one person at a time and do good work, and it's going to grow with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great takeaway, again, for coaches and even, clients and the listeners who are looking for a comp prep coach, is, again, focusing more on the results and what's right in front of you. And I think that can be said for even if you're not coaching physique, because I must admit, I've found, even through personal experience, that, again, you get results for people and you really give everything and you give that value, you will get referrals. You will get people coming to you, and they're the people who are going to stay with you. They're the clients who are going to be loyal, and they're the people who are going to apply that knowledge rather than people who don't really want to be there. And I guess, you use Peter as an example, and there's a lot of coaches that come to mind that I can think of. And again, they're, yes, and we talked about this before we started, there's a bit of an uprise. I think, a lot of them now are getting traction on social media because people are starting to realize, oh, okay, perhaps the fitness models with the best images are not quite the people who have the best knowledge or the biggest following, but it's more the people who are actually getting results, who are perhaps a little bit more authentic, genuine, a bit new to that social media space. But like you said, they are full constantly. They've got waiting lists. But it comes back again to those basics, right? Like working with people, giving them that value, focusing on what is in front of you right now, and then it all kind of comes full circle. I know that's something that I had a consultation yesterday, to use a real life example, and I was upfront with the person who wanted me to bring them into competition. I said, look, I've only competed once, so you will be, even though I've got people stage lean, they've not competed because I didn't want to, funnily enough, but will you give me this opportunity? And just being very honest and very transparent, so that they know that, hey, like, this person, like myself, might not have all the experience, but at least, I have the mentors, I have the coaches, I have access to the knowledge. I'm constantly upskilling, which we were talking about before we started, and having that guidance and support, and them giving me an opportunity. And that could be, my if I want to continue more that physique coaching as well, that route to actually getting my foot in the door. So that was really valuable, Cliff, I think, for myself and a lot of people listening, because, again, focus on the quality over the quantity.
Oh yeah, and you nailed it too. Is like, I think that one thing that, with these like polished Instagram accounts, like, you see some of these accounts, they have hundreds of thousands of followers. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes to build up such a following, that's a job in itself. And I mean, it's really hard to be really, really good at one thing. Coaching or, command of the research or being a researcher. Yes. And then you add on top But then you need to be really, really good at this other thing, which is like social media marketing.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not impossible, or, sometimes people hire out to do that, but, oftentimes it's like when you see these like extremely polished social media accounts, it tells you where their time is going. You know what I mean? Their time is going into their social media account, not necessarily their coaching and their study and their craft, really. And so, yeah, I think at a certain point you kind of need to ask yourself, I guess a big problem that I often have is sometimes I'll be approached by younger coaches and they'll say something along the lines of, they ask me so many questions about how to get their name out there and not enough questions about like how to improve their craft. Because I really think like bodybuilding and physique sport in general is a craft, because there is a mixture of skill and science. And so, I find it strange when I get so many questions on advertising when I'm like, you need to have a better product to advertise to start with.
Yeah, 100%. And you've kind of answered the first part of a question I wanted to dive into, which was, effective comp prep strategies, which we'll get onto. But the last bit was more, what are the traits, what are the behaviors and habits of a successful coach? And I think this is a point that, again, we've touched base on a few times, even at this early stage, of people are putting their energy in the wrong place. You told me when we first, got on this call that, you spent the early years getting in front of people, focusing on the client, and you didn't really pay attention to having a nice website or having all the right contact information. But yet here you are, excuse me, very successful, and you never really struggled for clients because you were focusing where the priorities were, which was getting in front of people and actually doing the work and getting results.
Yeah, the crazy thing is, so I didn't even really use. I didn't really have a website. I didn't use social media. So a lot of people from back in the day were really well known for the bodybuilding.com message boards. I mean, practically everybody I think was on there that I know of. Like Lane Norton was on there, Eric Helms, yes, Ryan Doris. And it's funny because I was actually in Singapore just a couple months ago when I was speaking with Eric Helms and Alberto Nunez. Mm-hmm. And they were asking me if I was on there, and I was like, no, I didn't even know that they existed. Because in those early years, honestly, I was buried in my own thing. And so I guess my point with that is that there's not any one standard way to get yourself established, because the route that a lot of guys took, I took a completely different route. And so honestly, it's kind of funny because sometimes when people talk to me about like when I started coaching, they always would be like, you came out of nowhere. And it was because I had zero online presence.
Yes.
And so I had zero online presence. And then one day you wouldn't actually know the thing that actually grew my business.
Yes. Go on.
So I did my marketing thing was because once again, I was like just late to the party on social media. I was like, when I have a good client, I'm going to give them a t-shirt with my email address on it. And I would give my clients, I had like 6 of them at the time. I was like, I'll give my clients a t-shirt with my, logo and my email address on the back. I was like, if I have the guy or girl at the show, the one that everybody, that shocks everyone. I'm like, not everybody will walk up and ask them what they're doing. But they'll look at their shirt. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And, I just put Team Wilson on it, and I put, my logo, and I put and I mean, honestly, I had almost a full roster before I ever had a website. I just had an email address on t-shirts. And, a lot of people were like, I saw this t-shirt at the show. This really, this awesome guy was wearing it. And it was just, cheap $12 t-shirts that I was giving my clients. And that was pretty much it. And then later on, I was like, I probably need to start like doing something online.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it comes back to that, your actions speak louder than words, right? And people will gravitate towards a physique or people who are, in condition, especially on stage day. Everyone's very quite emotional. And if you're not happy with your results, you're looking at people in your class or even out of your class that are really dialed in, they're professional, they present beautiful physique, they do well. And you sort of generally go, oh, hang on, if I'm not happy with how I'm looking, maybe, hey, what are you doing? And who do you coach with? And so I think that's really paramount as well for advertising. And again, it's simple things, right? Word of mouth will always be the best. And so I guess to digress away from
that a little bit more and get a little bit deeper, let's talk about effective comp prep strategies now. And again, I know this is a big topic, but if we can kind of, I guess, sort of ballpark it a little bit and talk about, again, more what you think and what you believe in your experience have been effective strategies when you get an athlete on board and then are going into the comp prep.
Yeah. So I'm when it comes to effective strategies, I'm actually very interested in that topic because I think a lot of people miss the boat on what are the most important things.
Yes.
So, as I mentioned, myself and Peter Fitchin, we wrote a book on bodybuilding, and it's interesting. When we wrote the book, we were like, hey, we want somebody who, we wanted the main things that we do in the book, and we wanted emphasis on the things that we considered the most important parts of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting because I have found that the people that get now the feedback, like we have awesome ratings on like Amazon, and like I think we're almost 5 stars on Amazon, and we actually the sales have been awesome. But one thing I found interesting is that the more, I'm going to say, scientific bodybuilding crowd has been like, yeah, but where's the we need a formula for calculating our volume and stuff like this. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit, but
Sure.
they're like you're spending too much time on this subject or that subject. But then I see their contest prep photos and I'm like, you clearly didn't take heed that this is why you didn't look good. Like I could spot certain things.
Yes.
Like for an example, I think one thing that a lot of people find really boring is determining length of contest prep. It's a subject that people are like, boo, I don't want to hear determining length of contest prep. But in my opinion, determining the length of a contest prep, appropriate length of contest prep, is the first and foremost most important factor in whether or not you're going to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
I am not joking. I haven't added it up recently, but last time I did, something around only 6% of people that apply to work with me have picked an appropriate show length. The other 94% are choosing shows that are too soon.
Yes.
And so what that means is I could make all of the correct macronutrient and caloric changes, give them all of the right training and cardio. They will still not look good enough because it's too soon.
Mm-hmm.
And they need more time. So I think that determining an appropriate length and giving yourself enough time to be ready. And once again, I know it sounds like the most boring subject, but I think it is. Nothing else matters if you miss that one. And so I think oftentimes you're going to do well to have, for men, we're going to say somewhere around a pound or 1.2 pounds per week to be dropped, per week. And then women, it's probably even less than that. Like women in particular, it's pretty hard to get, lose somewhere in the range of a half a kilogram per week for women. So I think that's if we're going to talk effective strategy, you have to be able to determine how much weight you need to lose and then how much time you need to lose it. So that first and foremost. Because oftentimes you see people where they're just grinding into a show, and they're still not even really ready. They probably need to lose, several pounds. So I'm going to put that first and foremost. Secondarily, when we look at effective strategies, I think a lot of it is patience. One thing I always tell people as a coach, I focus a lot on impulse control.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because people tend to be reactionary. Let me put it this way: overreactionary. If they have a stalled week, they start making these massive changes to their diet. Or if they have a week where they lose, maybe too much weight, more than they wanted, they start adding in a lot of food, or they do this justification of, I need a big refeed, let me order this pizza.
Yeah, it's like a knee-jerk reaction sort of thing.
Yes, yeah. So if I'm going to talk effective strategy, I'm going to say the next important thing after you've chosen appropriate length is subtlety. Subtlety of changes, subtlety of approach, and it's not this overhaul that you need to really, you need to have a drastic reaction to everything that takes place during your contest prep. And I just see that a lot. And so I think that strategically speaking, you need to also plan for that subtlety, because if you get to the point where you are 10 weeks out, and you're like, God, I'm way behind, I need to start slashing food, that was poor planning. You know what I mean? Like, yes. You were too subtle. And then I'm going to put one other strategy that I think is just good practice. And I put this in I don't really have a name for it, but I'm just going to say, like, knowing when to use and when to conserve energy. Oftentimes I feel like at the beginning of a contest prep that is long, we'll say like long, we'll say 20 weeks, 25 weeks.
Yes.
People really dip their toe in the water during those first 5-8 weeks. It's almost like because they're not mentally ready to devote and go all in.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes I feel like it's a better strategy to put a little more energy in at the beginning so that you don't have to put as much in at the end. It's really easy to slow down progress. It's really hard to speed it up. And so one way I sell this to my clients oftentimes is like, everybody is going to be pushing hard at 4 weeks out. How in the hell are you going to differentiate yourself when everybody is already, going full speed? Mm-hmm. You differentiate yourself at 20 weeks.
Yes.
Not a lot of people have the ability to put their foot on the gas and push themselves at 20 weeks out. And so I expect that of my clients. I say, hey, let's push ourselves now. And then when we get to 12 weeks out and we're ahead of schedule, we can actually like pull back, maybe add some calories back in or reduce our cardio a little bit, because it's much easier to, gauge how close you need to come in. So yeah, I would put the last strategy is like, don't always be so, you want subtlety, but you don't want to be timid, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does.
Yeah.
I thank you for kind of like segregating and bullet pointing those, Cliff, which I think are great. And, to add on to that, I think the timeline thing that you started with, so vital. It seems that people really have it wrong. I think one of the biggest, and again, I wanted to cover a lot of misconceptions in this, and I think we're already starting to hit those. People, they're not giving themselves enough time, aligned with everything else as well. It's this general 12 weeks. Why have we chose this 12 weeks? This is an arbitrary number.
Yeah.
And as we know, when we want to get, lean, very shredded, quote unquote, we want to have a longer time frame. We almost want to have, like you said, room to push. We want to have room for error. And I know I had a conversation with Dr. Joe Klemczewski about, and his approaches, and he does also like the metabolic building phase. And, he has that, we really want to come in early. And I think this seems to be a trend with a lot of the top level coaches who are getting people ultra conditioned now is, again, we're pushing, but we have a bigger timeline. We have room to, like you said, perhaps take our foot off the gas, perhaps diet breaks, perhaps increase calories, reduce cardio, etc., rather than going, shit, we're just going to go all or nothing in 12 weeks and perhaps not come in shredded and lose a lot of muscle mass. And I mean, that's a horrible experience. And I guess to kind of touch, to full circle loop on the last point you made there in terms of differentiating yourself, I've not heard of that before. I think that's great for the listeners in terms of, you're right, everyone's going to be pushing 4 weeks out because it's like, oh yeah, this is the start of the comp prep, I'm just going to kind of mosey on in here, going to dance along in. It's like, well, hang on a minute, like we don't want to have this knee-jerk reactionary, like black and white, but it's like, okay, we're starting comp prep now, let's take this seriously. I'll use an example. I said to one of my friends and fellow athletes a couple of years ago, and he'd just come off back of a comp prep, and he'd had a bit of time off, and he was doing the reverse or recovery diet, however you want to coin and talk about that. But, he said, oh, I think I'm going to compete another 2 years, this, that, and the other. And I said, well, he had a bit of a plan. I said, well, really? I said, without sounding too like hardcore, I said, it starts now. And he says, what do you mean? I said, your comp prep's already started. And he says, what do you mean? I said, and that might sound a bit foreign, but I said, well, hear me out. I said, if you break this down into weeks and months, it's actually not that far away. And I said, although you want to have a bit of a break, and I said, but if you want to come in better, you got to have a plan now for your off season. You got to know exactly what you want to bring up. You got to know exactly when you're going to come in next time, who you're going to coach with, how you're going to approach it. And I think that's what a lot of athletes kind of really miss, because, to quote Eric Helms as well, it's bodybuilding, right? We're not like getting shredded, as challenging as it is not where we build that muscle mass. It's in the off season when perhaps we don't see, this instant gratification of results. And I think a lot of people don't really, take that as serious. And then when they come to the comp prep, it's like, oh, wow, we're just going to kind of wait till the last minute. So that's some really great points there, I think, Cliff, and having that different mindset. It kind of, again, leads into the next question of, we talk about evidence-based versus anecdotal, so hands-on experience. And you said to me, you come from a place where you kind of did the opposite way around, right? You started off with actual hands-on experience, and then you looked at evidence to back that up, which I think is great. It's different because sometimes, again, the books and the literature don't really make sense. So my question to you is, in your experience, when do you throw the rule book out? When do you, look towards the hands-on experience that you've gained versus the actual evidence when you're, in comp prep with your athletes? And perhaps could you give us some real life examples of athletes you've worked with where you've gone, oh, wow, like this is not what the literature sort of says, or it doesn't even make sense from a scientific standpoint, but from an experience standpoint, or now I have witnessed this is something that generally occurs.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's so kind of talking about the kind of going back to something I mentioned was like the book that Pete and I wrote. We actually, our book is actually is accredited through the International Society of Sports Nutrition.
Yeah, ISSN.
So it is. So Pete and I, for example, are obviously huge proponents of science. Pete should be. He has his PhD. Pete and I often find ourselves battling what is probably considered more of the evidence-based group. Kind of funny, one thing I always say is I often feel like my social media following gets hindered because oftentimes I post things and I kind of do things that fly in the face of the more evidence-based group, and they're like, boo, we don't like this. And the more of the bro crowd is like, yeah. And then the very next day I post something that kind of flies completely in the face of the bro crowd, and they're like, boo. You know what I mean? I'm pissing everyone off with the stuff I post. Kind of actually a funny side story, and I guess in the beginning of my coaching career, because I do think human beings and kind of even what we're talking about before with clients, I think a big part of what my coaching is getting clients to buy into what you are having them do. And oftentimes, you have to know the psychology of the people you're working with. Like, everyone needs to hear something at certain points, either to buy into what you're doing or to get them to push when you need them to push. And so, even looking at my own psychology as a coach, in the early stages, I didn't have the education that like Lane Norton did, or Dr. Joe had, or Eric Helms. And I kind of had this like, what type of coach am I moment? And, funny thing, so my dad actually has his PhD in an entirely unrelated field. He's a plant pathologist.
Right.
And, and he told me that, he was at a conference one time, and it was filled with PhDs, and, the whole audience was filled with PhDs and experts in their field. And he said this guy got up who had his bachelor's degree in business, not in plant pathology, but he had worked many years on the business end of plant technologies. Mm-hmm. And he said he got up and he gave a presentation of things that were at the time completely unproven by the research, but innovative. he said they made sense in scientific terms in what he was presenting, and they were based off of things that he had witnessed over the years because he'd just been in the business. And he said the crowd was blown away, and he said the scientists in that audience went on to test a lot of his theories, and they turned out to be correct, a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And kind of and my dad was saying, really, he observed. He said he observed what seemed to be working, took what he knew about the science behind it, and presented some ideas for maybe why this seemed to work. And that I really took that to heart in my coaching. I think oftentimes, a lot of times I see, I read the research, of course, but I guess my approach isn't I read the research and then I go into real life and I try it out. My approach is I try things out based on maybe some ideas like why this might work, but try some things out and then I follow what works, and then I'm like, why might this be working? Because at least in my experience, most of the things that go to be eventually be researched, the reason they are being researched is because somebody's been doing it already. You know what I mean? Like, usually they don't start just researching things that nobody's been doing. And so my view as a coach is a lot of times if you wait for something to be research proven, you're probably late to the game. And so, of course, stay up on the research. And sometimes reading the research can also foster new innovations or new ideas in people. And so I guess what I'm saying is there needs to be this halfway area. You know what I mean? Like you can't just turn a blind eye to science and be like, no, I know what works. Sometimes I've been doing some things and research has come out that make me say, maybe I need to change the way I do things. But then there's other times where research comes out and I'm like, I don't think that will work for everyone in every situation because I've seen that. And then you start to, maybe try to connect the dots for why that may be. I actually just made a post the other day that angered some people where I was saying, like, I think bodybuilders have actually become too reliant on formulas and equations in bodybuilding. Because one of the aspects of that is that it sort of is a cookie cutter approach in my opinion. When, I get questions a lot for how do I determine protein intake? How do I calculate volume for the week? How do I calculate caloric intake? I'm like, man, these are vast, like there's no calculation because the range at which people can fall in is so wide. And it's very interesting. So I was having a debate with someone online about the formulas and equations. And I said, if I take, if I take the caloric calculations for like maintenance level and I give them to a 22-year-old white female, it's going to be drastically different than if I take that calculation and give it to a 47-year-old black female, because different demographics are going to have vastly different needs and different genetics. Which actually somebody actually emailed me because I'm not a medical doctor, but she was a medical doctor, and she emailed me and she was saying that there's actually quite a bit different medications they give to their clients of African descent versus their white clients or patients, because they'll have different reactions to it. And so training and diet and cardio are exactly the same way in my experience.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And I want to sort of delve into that. And again, that springboards us to sort of the next topic. But to circle back to what you were saying, I think there is such a fine line, isn't there? And it's always trying to maintain that balance and, be very much sort of almost like, it's like spinning plates, in many ways. Like you've got to kind of keep them spinning between, okay, well, I'm using the science, I'm using the evidence, and I'll use an example. I'll build a metaphorical picture for people. And I say, the evidence is like a house, right? To construct a house, there are things that are non-negotiable. that you will always need to build a successful structure. You start with the framing, etc. You have to put sort of, the base in there. You might have to use the concrete, etc., and all the materials. I'm not a builder. I don't know all the technical terms. However, then when you get to the specifics and you look at the furnishings of a house and you look at finishing off, and you might say, I want this kind of skirting board, and I want this sort of finish and these blinds and all that. And that is subjective, and there's no right or wrong in that to a degree. There's just things that perhaps work better for that preference, for that home, or whatever it might be. And I feel like having that view and being able to do that as a coach in the physique realms, or even in any part of life, where you can go, well, look, we can't argue with this. Like, energy balance is what it is, right? Until proven otherwise. But that's not likely to change anytime soon, unless we physiologically, have alien descent or something of such. But then when we look at the specifics, because again, when we're taking people to the extreme, this is where specificity really comes in, and individuality, because, I guess to use the term general pop, that's not going to be as highlighted as when you get someone where you're like, wow, like, we have got a lot of individuality here to get everyone with shredded glutes, like person A, Sam versus Sarah, or whatever it might be. Like, there's going to be so much variance of change there. So I think it's great to have that approach, Cliff, and I think more coaches would do well to understand this, because I think we do see two camps now, where we see people who are just really evidence-based, and it's like, man, you are lacking so many gains in. You've got it quoted, I think, on your email, on your site, like, intensity is everything. It's like, dude, you're working so smart, you're forgetting to work hard. And then you've got the people on the other side who are working so damn hard, but you're like, you are now not working smart, and you are running yourself into the ground. So, finding, again, that middle ground and that place where you can sort of jump between one and the other. And like you said, pissing people off on social media, because you don't have to be part of one crowd.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the problem is, like, it becomes like identity politics. You know what I mean? Like, people start to identify with this, and I'm like, it maybe just become the guy that, like, chases what works. You know what I mean? Like, a perfect example of this. So, like, when I actually recommend to newer coaches, start with the research. You know what I mean? Like, if you're a newer coach, start with what is research proven, and then maybe branch out from there. But then as you gain more experience, then you can start going off of your experiences. Like, a perfect example, when I started coaching, it was like 2009, 2010. The research was very much in favor of HIIT cardio. Yes. High intensity interval training. And it's what I started off with. And, but then I was like, man, like, when I would look at a lot of the more, like, bro bodybuilders, I was like, man, they look fuller when they keep their cardio in. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, this, you know what I mean? Like, this, I was like, something, I started even noticing when I would really, like, start to add cardio in, I was like, my clients start to look flat. You know what I mean? Like, when I added the HIIT cardio. So then I started thinking, I was like, what? And then I was like, okay, all the research at the time was very much in favor of HIIT cardio. And I was like, but this doesn't make sense, because, like, so I'm even though I'm opposing what the research says, I'm still thinking scientific approach in my head. So I'm like, this doesn't make sense. HIIT cardio's primary fuel is glucose. Weight training's primary fuel is glucose. If we are dieting, the primary fuel for weight training is being robbed by our cardio. So we're kind of harming our weight training. We're diminishing how much effort, intensity, how much weight we're going to be able to lift. So, okay, obviously HIIT isn't good in that regard. But then the other aspect is HIIT cardio is also really taxing, mentally and physically. Like, it's very draining. So it requires a lot of recovery, mentally and physically. Because if you're in prep and you've ever tried, like, doing sprint intervals, it's almost like mentally traumatizing. And so I'm like, okay, we are impacting our training beforehand by robbing our fuel source, and then we're impacting our training on the back end by demanding much more recovery. I'm like, it takes no recovery to go for a walk. Like, you know what I mean? And so, so around early 2013, and this is like the point where HIIT was hitting, like, peak, mania. I was like, I was like posting on social media, I was like, HIIT sucks. I was like, don't do it. You know what I mean? I was like, I'm not doing it with my clients anymore. And people were like, you're anti-science. You know what I mean? Like, you're anti-science. I'm like, no, I'm not anti-science. I'm like, I have scientific reasons for this. I was like, the research is incomplete at this point. And now within like the past 2 years, the research is showing, yeah, for bodybuilding purposes, HIIT probably isn't as good as low intensity cardio.
Right.
And so, it's okay to challenge. I guess this is where I'm going to encourage the intelligent people out there to be like, it is not anti-science to challenge current scientific research, because in my opinion, that's how science progresses forward, is you constantly challenge the status quo and aim to push it farther. So yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is, don't get yourself trapped in this identity that you are one or the other.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I'm going to double down on that as well and say, and you went back over this before, the reason why we have evidence and research and, journal articles and meta-analyses and all of these things is because people have tried this stuff. And then now we've gone, well, okay, let's test and test and test and test and peer review and all of this carry on to the point where we go, okay, well, yeah, we have some legitimate like evidence, like this theory is not now a theory because it works. It's evidence, right? And obviously there's always more research to do, but I think it goes back to the example you were saying before, like these blokes are pioneers, and like yourself, you are in a way a pioneer of your industry because you're willing to test and try things that, yeah, you know what, they don't work, but that's how you find out if something works or it doesn't, because that's just feedback. It's not failure. It's just going, okay, well, perhaps this approach doesn't work and this one's a little bit better, but you never know if you stay between the guidelines of the literature. You need to go out there and, like you said, test these theories, and perhaps they don't quite always align with what we thought to be true, as obviously you've just been saying yourself.
Yeah, and the biggest thing is I've tried things that I didn't think were all that effective when I tried them, and I don't. By the way, I don't test things on my clients without running them by them first. I'm like, yeah, I've got this idea. What do you
sure.
think? I usually actually test things on my more educated clients that are curious, like I am, and I'll present them with something, and they're like, hey, that sounds pretty good. Let's give it a try. But you know what I mean? I think it's one of those things that there's absolutely nothing wrong in playing it safe and sticking with what the research is showing at the time. But just always remember that training and nutrition, in particular bodybuilding research, is very narrow and has limitations in real life application. You know what I mean? A lot of research is done on usually college age white guys and the elderly. You know what I mean? It's easy to scrounge up some college age white guys, you know what I mean, for your study, and it's easy to scrounge up some elderly subjects for your study. It doesn't tell you, you know what I mean, and a lot of times the things like real life stresses, diet adherence, subjects variability. I haven't seen any training or nutrition, not a lot of training studies done on all black females.
No. And there's so many exciting, so much exciting research to be done now. And I know that there's a lot more, because now we're getting funding and education, for, again, people in our industry to actually, how cool is it that now they're getting paid to actually test some of these theories, or be able to go in and be like, cool, we're literally getting paid to see how good we can make people look. Like, that's pretty damn cool. And I think if people understand the research a little bit more, they would definitely be asking better questions and not making perhaps this like reactional knee-jerk approaches. It's kind of like, we use the Game Changers as an example that just come out, and everyone's like, oh yeah, plant-based. But it's like, man, if people actually understood research, like, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, but they actually understood like how research is formulated, how it's taken, the data, and even actually, again, stumbled across literature or people with, more sound knowledge, rather than just watching something. But again, it's on Netflix, it's fancy, it's nice, you've got some of your favorite, celebrities on there. But now everyone's, oh no, that's it. And then, it sort of snowballs off. So that is interesting in and of itself, but that's a whole different podcast. Yeah, right. But I've had to talk many people out of that. I'm like, no, you're not going plant-based. We don't need to do that unless for an ethical reason. But anyway, and then going back to cardio, again, I just want to touch base on this before we move on to the next question. I recently did a vlog about this because I think, people can think, with myself, I'm anti-cardio, and I think we to use an example, cardio is a tool. Like, we are practitioners, we use tools, just like, again, a builder, a surgeon uses different tools for the right job. Just because, I've got a hammer doesn't mean everything's a nail, and you've got to be able to use the appropriate tools at the right time. And I think as practitioners, we should have that mindset and go, well, a lot of people, and this is really big, not even just the physique realm, but I don't know how many people I see every day, and they are just constantly doing cardio, like all the time, off season, on season, and they do the same shit every day. And I'm like, if you only understood some basic principles of energy, like, why are you doing this? You want to look like a physique athlete. Like, probably, all right, to a degree, at the very least, you're not really harming like your results, but at the maximum, you're wasting time and you're taking energy away from, like you said, the focus of, if you want to be a strength-based athlete, a physique athlete, the resistance training protocols is where you need to prioritize your time and your energy. And you don't want your body to be adapting to this cardio, let alone wasting your time with it. But no, it's like, no, got to do my cardio, got to do my fasted cardio, got to do my, that's because that's what everyone else does. Got to get my protein shake after that. It's like, let's get off the hamster wheel for a second and let's have a look at it, And again, you can practice, you can preach it, and people have got to come to their own conclusions. But I just think that's, to kind of piggyback on what you're saying with the cardio, a really good example, which we can all relate to as clients and coaches and people in a gym setting. We see it every day. And I don't know if you've got any more that you want to tack onto that before we move on, Cliff.
No, I guess the biggest thing that I always tell my clients with like cardio and certain things, like people are working unnecessarily hard. I'm like, are you wanting to actually work hard, or do you just want to give yourself the feeling of working hard? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
It's that's comes down to that. But no, I totally agree.
Yeah, it's almost like a bad habit. Right? It's like they're afraid to let it go. I'm like, man, you put it into the weights, you'll get far more return. Anyway,
I try to actually prep people without cardio at all, if possible. I mean, in the past couple of years, I've probably prepped 20 people without cardio one bit. I've done my last 2 preps completely cardio free.
Yeah, look, 100%. I'm not saying that that's the be all and end all, and if you have to use cardio, you have to. But I think if people are really adherent with their nutrition and they're not completely sedentary, the best way to offset energy balance when you need to is, as you said, low intensity, steady state cardio, or even just getting a step goal. Oh, you're hitting 8,000 steps a day, hit 10,000. That's an extra 2,000 a day. That's huge. And again, it's not going to really affect your performance in the gym, rather than doing all this hit, and your body's not going to be like, oh, I'm going to adapt now. You got to do heaps more cardio. And I know the best athletes and coaches, in my opinion, and that of, if you look at their results, are generally very minimal, and they are quite pragmatic when they approach their cardio interventions and when they prescribe it. Because if you've got enough lean mass, and again, for most people, you're programming right, you should not need next to any cardio as a physique athlete and come in absolutely shredded.
Yeah, and I try to make sure I cater to the client's mental needs. So I even try to like cut down on their stress. Like, one thing I'll even do is I'll say, like, if a person seems particularly stressed out, I'll say things like, why don't you go for 2 walks this week for like 30 minutes, go with your husband, and guess what? I don't want you to talk about bodybuilding the whole time.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, sometimes it's like taking them out of that space, like, because one, they're going to get extra steps in, 2 30-minute walks. Also, they're going to be speaking to their significant other, burns calories also. The other thing is that talking about things that are not bodybuilding related will probably make their relationship better. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And like, then things become a little more relaxed. You know what I mean? Like, because also people get like really zoned in on contest prep, and all they can talk about is bodybuilding, and it annoys the crap out of their spouse. You know what I mean? I'm like, talk about something less polarizing than bodybuilding for once. Talk about politics. But I'm like, do things that make your life better, and prep will become easier too. But that's a whole other topic.
It is. I was just going to say that is a whole other topic, and I'm really passionate about that, because I think, again, it's good to have that balance and taking your mind off it for a bit. It's such a great way. And like you said, it ticks many boxes there to do that sort of thing. I know that certainly helped when I was in comp prep. For me, getting the old podcast in, going for a walk near the beach, takes your mind off it, chilling out. Now to sort of jump into my next question, and this is something that I have a lot of curiosity around. And I know a lot of people will be interested in this. And again, it's a bit taboo, but I'd really like you to share your experience on it, which is, you mentioned at the start, coaching performance enhanced athletes versus natural athletes. And I know, even from my standpoint, I'd really love to know what are the main differences in terms of when you're bringing someone who is enhanced versus natural in, from a mechanistic or a physiological perspective. Are there that many differences? And what are the recommendations and considerations that you generally need to take into account to get someone of the same standard on the stage looking, completely diced, quote unquote?
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. So I would say the majority of my athletes are natural, but I would say at this point, probably about 25% are enhanced athletes. I always tell people, I would prefer to just work with good people.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, that's my number one thing. So I mean, in terms of things that I do a little bit differently, first and foremost, if we're going to talk about contest prep length, I said being like the one of the most important things, if not the most important to begin with. Enhanced athletes can lose weight much faster and not lose muscle tissue. So oftentimes their contest prep can be a little more drastic in nature. I mean, you can take male bodybuilders, and rather than having them lose a pound or half a kilogram per week, roughly half a kilogram per week, you can, increase that to 2 to 3 pounds per week. And I'm going to say 2 to 3 pounds, but oftentimes they're not even losing weight as they're going in, because they're, if they're increasing their dosage of certain, PEDs, they'll actually gain muscle going into the show. And it's actually beneficial to not have these long drawn out preps for enhanced athletes, because if you shorten the prep length, you are increasing the growth time. And where like natural bodybuilders, oh yeah, we cut our off season 6 weeks short. I mean, realistically, natural bodybuilders are not going to grow any noticeable amount of muscle tissue in 6 weeks.
No.
But enhanced athletes, yeah, maybe. You know what I mean? And so if you can increase things out 6 weeks, you know what I mean, do it. And then you can cut a little quicker, because you're not going to lose muscle tissue due to some of the PEDs that people are taking. Other things that may be different is fasted cardio. Because something like somebody using certain substances like growth hormone, you know what I mean? Like if you take that in the morning, you're going to be a little bit better off doing your cardio after you take that. And if you eat, it could blunt that. Something like growth hormone, a lot of enhanced athletes I see do better with fasted cardio.
Right. Interesting.
The other things I would say, some of the biggest differences that I see are in peaking, actually, because enhanced athletes tend to hold more subcutaneous water.
Yes.
I would say sodium needs are a little bit more up in the air. Some people do really, really well with more sodium as enhanced athletes. Some people really, I think this is where sort of that idea of like cut your sodium 3 days out, and some enhanced athletes have done pretty well with that, is because like they maintain a lot more fullness than natural bodybuilders. Natural bodybuilders cut their sodium 3 days out. They're not going to get a pump to save their life. Whereas like enhanced athletes can cut their enhanced athletes can cut their sodium and still get a pump. Now, I don't think it's good for anybody to cut sodium 3 days out. But what I'm saying is, oftentimes I find that in order to combat some of that subcutaneous water retention, you have to go lower with some enhanced athletes than you normally would with a natural athlete. And then last thing I guess I would say as a differentiator is carbing up. So two different things. One, judging in a lot of enhanced federations is a little different than in natural federations. Conditioning isn't as highly valued in enhanced competitions as it is in natural competitions. It's valued, but it's just more important, more valued in the natural shows. So oftentimes, if you are carving someone up, you are going to be a little bit better off with being a little, like the old saying, the saying that I would it is. It's better to be a little flat than a little spilled. But I think that's more true for natural competitors. I think for enhanced competitors, it might be a little bit better to be a little spilled than a little flat. Obviously, you want to hit it spot on, but I think you want to err on the side of a little bit more aggressive in the enhanced arena. And the other thing, especially when dealing with like very large bodybuilders, if you're dealing with somebody that's 240, 250 pounds, that is a lot of muscle tissue to fill out with glycogen.
Yeah.
So like if they are very flat, their muscle tissue is not going to push out very tightly against the skin. So being very flat for a large bodybuilder can produce a pretty soft look. So being flat can be very detrimental, because it will hurt their conditioning and their look on stage. You need them to be full in order to make everything pop and create that separation between muscle tissue. So I find the peaking aspect to be a significantly different ballgame when dealing with enhanced competitors versus natural competitors.
Yeah, no, that's good, Cliff. And so I guess to address those topics and put them into key points. So the main thing is the first point you mentioned was the time. So generally the duration with which an enhanced athlete can come in. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that generally you can have shorter time frames because they can rapidly build and lose fat, and as you said, at the same time into a competition. So what would be generally, say you have a natural athlete and you say 25 to 30 weeks, what time frame or timeline would you have for an enhanced athlete, depending on the competition?
Yeah, so I guess it would be a little bit difficult because it's depending on the size, because also the size of enhanced athletes can vary greatly. But for example, if I have a natural competitor that needs to lose 30 pounds of fatty tissue, I'm going to give them probably about 30 weeks, roughly, give or take, just as an example. But an enhanced athlete, I can probably do that in 20.
Right.
Because I can just be more aggressive. I don't need to worry now. I still think there's limits to because I obviously, you see some guys trying to diet off 50 pounds in 12 weeks. And I'm like, this is crazy. But, I think that you can push those limits a little bit in terms of how fast you're losing for sure, because you get that extra growth time out of it. And now from a mechanistic standpoint, one thing I will say is, it does seem like when you have enhanced athletes dieting for too long, it does hurt some of the fullness aspect. I'm not even entirely sure what that is, but it seems like they can be more impacted. Whereas natural bodybuilders, it's almost like if you keep it going and keep the pace long enough, they're going to retain that fullness. Whereas with enhanced athletes, I find that if you do push it too long, they will start to flatten out a little bit.
That's quite interesting. So there's like you said, there's a bit more of a specific window, but again, still keeping a more conservative approach and leaving yourself with if anything, a little bit more time. So like you said, you can carb them up and add calories back in to fuel performance. And then you mentioned about the sodium, which makes sense, I guess, from the perspective of, glycogen and how we store water in the body, etc. When you have, an enhanced athlete and you're bringing them on stage, and I know this is individual, Cliff, as well, do you generally have a protocol where you're keeping sodium at a consistent and then you're going to taper that off during the show and then peak it? Or again, is it very, very individual and specific, or is there a different approach?
It can be pretty individual. Usually, usually I get cues from people during their contest prep. If I feel like I'm not getting cues from them during their contest prep of how they handle sodium, things like that, then I'll ask them to run an experiment, hey, increase your sodium to 5,000 milligrams today and see how you look tomorrow. So I try to see the tendencies of somebody. There are demographic differences also, like black clients do not handle clear sodium, as well as white clients. It's like if most of the time, if I have a couple days of higher sodium for a white client, they're going to look fuller and probably even a little tighter. But for black clients, so oftentimes it's puffy pretty quick. So I run a couple different approaches. Now, I don't really know what the mechanism is for this, but I've talked to a couple other coaches that I trust their opinions and their results, and they've noticed the same thing with. So this is the same thing with carbohydrates. This is the same thing with sodium. I kind of see it with potassium a little bit, where different loading or unloading strategies produce different looks. And like, for those that actually have read my book, I put several peak week strategies in there because, I think the general school of thought with peaking used to be at the end of the week, you just want to make sure you're carved up. So like some people would do a front load and some people would do a back load, but as long as your glycogen tank is topped off, you're going to be good and you're going to be full. But I see different people have different looks as opposed to like, do you load them at the beginning of the week? Do you load them at the end of the week? Does it subtly build? Is it aggressive? And I see the same thing with sodium, where some people, like, if you subtly build their sodium up, they look awesome. If you hit them, you hit them all at once, they don't look good. But that may be flipped for somebody else. And so the best thing I can tell people to do is notice your tendencies, write them down, experiment with different sodium loading tendencies. Try 2 higher days, and then see how you look the following day, and then how do you look the day after that? Because some people actually look good if you load them with sodium for a few days and then back off, and then the day after the back off is when they're going to look their best. One of the ideas that I have about that could be that the human body has a lot of mechanisms in place to offset overages and shortages. When we're short on something, our body tends to conserve it. When we're over on something, our body tends to try to eliminate it more quickly. It's almost like there was this pendulum effect. When we restrict carbohydrates, our body creates more glycogen space within our muscle tissue to be able to overcompensate. So I think that some people might be more sensitive to those processes than other people. So I know that was not the clear-cut answer that you wanted at all.
No. No, but there isn't always a clear-cut answer, Cliff, and that's totally fine. I think that's what we need to acknowledge as well, because when we get into the fine end of the pencil, so to speak, like you said, there's no. This comes back to where you go, okay, we've got the evidence, and now we're going to rely on experience and testing approaches, and then recording that data and almost becoming our own scientist, like you said. And then the more data you have on an athlete, and with athletes, you start to then draw trends and conclusions, which I think is why it's so important, like you said, to make notes and have this, whether it's in images, whether it's actually written down, numbers, because then you can actually start to see trends over time. And that's when you may or may not go, okay, well, this seems to be like you've found with, like you said, some of your black athletes versus white athletes, you've seen these sort of trends and conclusions. That in and of itself is actually really interesting. And I know there's a lot of research still to be done in this department. And I'm looking forward to seeing that, purely based on the fact that when I was studying, I remember that it was always put forward that a black athlete or an African American would have more fast twitch muscle fibers, specifically type B. They're more muscular, they're generally sprinters, they just generally, not all, but they look more quote unquote jacked, right? And I was the guy in the class that would always ask questions because I wanted to know, I wanted to learn, and I didn't just take things as, oh, well, this is the way it is. And I'm like, yeah, but why? So I remember asking one day my my anatomy and physiology teacher, and I said, this is kind of like a known thing, and it's a bit almost like a joke, generally, the sprinters are usually colored and they're faster and they're more jacked. I'm like, why is this? And he said, well, and he sort of had a bit of a caveat because, we have multicultural class. And he says, I don't want to offend anyone, but part of it goes back to like the law of adaptation and like Darwin's theory of survival, where, back in the day, unfortunately, a lot of the black community were slaves and they didn't have access to, medicines. And so, the weak died, and the fittest of the fittest, bred with each other and created almost like, if you will, a super race, or adaptations which were more advantageous of survival, which were obviously more muscular. They were stronger, they were generally had stronger immune systems and so forth. And I think some of that again, is a bit of a digression of what we see, because, you know, we see a lot of colored athletes that are, wow, you know, just have more generally genetic, you know, size. It's not always the case, but generally, you know, they have those sort of bigger muscle bellies, and they look more, you know, jacked, if you will.
Yeah, you know, one thing that has kind of become so, interestingly enough, I think one of the reasons I tend to note the differences that I see between my white clients and my black clients, because I do coach an awful lot of black clients. And I've gotten good at it over the years, because my first 2 clients ever were black. And I remember when I first started coaching them, I started trying to coach them like I coached myself. You know what I mean? And the thing that worked really well for me just didn't work as well for them. And I'll be honest, I actually like kind of told them, I was like, guys, I kind of want to reset. Like after like 2 months, I was like, I want to try a couple different things. I was like, this just isn't working as well for you as it is for me. So I tried working with a couple different things, and some of the research points to the things that I've seen, like diabetes rates are higher in, among African Americans, and insulin resistance is more of an issue. And so it's like I absolutely see that. Like a lot of my black clients have to go lower carbohydrate, and I actually have I have awesome clients. I'm also going to state this because I'm a white guy, and I can usually just speak freely with them. I've asked them questions about where their family history is from and stuff like that, and we've had some great conversations. And they are really open to speaking with me about it. And so some things that we've even noticed is caloric intakes just tend to be lower for my black clients too. So one thing that's also kind of funny is I always say, obviously women have a harder time losing fat than men.
Yes.
And
Excuse me.
I often find that my black clients have a harder time losing fat than the white clients. And it would make sense because you mentioned, I'm sure that as awful as it is, I'm sure that slavery was a factor in it. Yeah. And then also, many parts of Africa don't have as much food available. And so it would make sense over the course of, hundreds and thousands of years that the people that could survive on less food in areas where food doesn't grow very easily, metabolic rates are just going to be lower because it equals higher survival. So what I was going to say is I always tell, whenever I have a client that's really complaining about having their food get low or their cardio get high, I'm like, you have never even seen a difficult prep until you've seen what a black female has to do to get lean. It is insane. I don't know if you've ever worked with black female clients, but no. Cardio, I've probably worked with 10 to 15 black female clients in my career, and man, we're talking always. I have never ever had an exception where a black female client did not need over an hour of cardio every single day. Wow. And we're talking carbohydrates down to we're talking calories usually down around the 1,000 gram mark, 1,000 calorie mark. But then they'll say things like, yeah, it's tough, but hey, I set a PR, and I'm like, geez, you're setting a PR while doing it, over an hour of cardio a day and 1,000 calories. So for any black females listening, one thing I will say is, but also every black female client that I have, they have to go through hell to get lean, but they are usually very good competitors once they are lean. I think that they have a tough road to go though to get there. Now, it can be disheartening. So I guess what I say is along those lines is it stinks from a genetic standpoint. You know what I mean? We all kind of have things that are more difficult, but black females definitely have the hardest road to go when it comes to getting stage lean and losing fat. But it's very doable. And I guess the thing that I always try to let them know is that this hardship to get lean is not abnormal at all by any means. It's pretty common. I think sometimes the difficulty for anybody, regardless of what demographic they fall in, I think sometimes when people have a harder time losing weight than the next person, it it kind of feels like, what's wrong? You know what I mean? And I think sometimes knowing, hey, there's nothing wrong. We just got to keep going with it, and you're going to get there. It helps. You know what I mean? It helps to know that, like, hey, this isn't abnormal. This is pretty common. We'll just keep going with it.
Yeah, that is quite interesting, actually. And it's almost, sorry, go on.
No, I was gonna say, and on that note, also, I actually see one of the other issues. I also coach a lot of husband and wife couples that compete at the same time, and it's usually harder on the women when they look at their husband and they see, like, the husband is not doing much cardio. You know what I mean? His calories are higher, and they're like, "What the hell?" You know what I mean? They're like, "What the hell? Like, why is the scale not moving for me?" And like, it's another unfortunate fact that, like, women are usually gonna just have a harder time losing fat than guys.
Oh yeah, I can empathize with that. Like, I don't coach comp prep couples, but I coach a lot of couples, and it's quite funny because I have two opposite scenarios. I have one where the guy's like literally dropping a kilo a week, right? And he's just like, I don't even have to touch his macros. He turns up, he's like, everything's great, right? He's still pretty beginner, so he can kind of build strength and all that. And his partner is still losing weight, but like half the percentage. And she's like, but Jeremy, and he's always, and I'm like, hey, it's all good. Like, you're still moving in the right direction. I'm like, you're a smaller person. You have to sort of define that. But I said, look, you can't compare yourself, with your husband. There's so many different factors. And then on the opposite side, I've got another couple, one of them who the male is getting very lean. And the female, she's got a super fast metabolism. She's like got the opposite problem. So she's on more calories than him, just where they're at the timeline. And she's making fun of him because, she's eating all this rice, and he's like he's like, this is bullshit. Like, I should be eating more than her. And I'm like, mate, to get lean, sometimes, we have this expectation of, I shouldn't have to go below these calories. And I know I certainly did. Like, I got down. Wow. I mean, I can get lean with 3,000 calories, and then to get me shredded and lines in my ass at this point, it was like 1,400. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I know you've talked about it with some athletes. So again, it's like losing that whole, like, it doesn't matter. Sometimes you've just got to do whatever you've got to do. And to go back what you were saying with your black clients, I think it is good to understand that. And it's an interesting trend that you find. I know there's a female in our gym, and she competes in physique, and she's quite small in terms of her structure, but wow, her physique is phenomenal. But she often talks to me about, how challenging it is. And she has these workouts, and I'm like, wow, you're still here. And she's like, yeah, I've she's got a really good coach. And she's like, I've got to do all this work. And I guess now for me, that makes actually a little bit more sense from what you were saying to kind of build that back in, which is, it is quite refreshing to hear. And it kind of puts that into context a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing that's also very interesting to me too, is like, I think sometimes, like, people will hear what somebody's doing. Like, I do this much cardio per day, and, I am down to, 40 grams of cardio per day. And somebody on the outside will be like, that's way too extreme.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, you don't know. Maybe they were not losing weight on 55 minutes of cardio per day and, 60 grams of carbohydrates. So they had to go to the next inevitable step. But, people that generally have a harder time losing weight, losing fat, those same, I'm going to call them conservationist genetics. You know what I mean? Their body conserves energy in all forms. Generally, those conservationist genetics also lead to the ability to conserve and preserve muscle during times of caloric deficit. I mean, we talked about male and female too. Oftentimes, when you look at, the research is starting to show this, but men lose more muscle during contest prep than women, if we're talking about natural competitors.
Yeah.
And it shows too, also, because, like, you give a guy 30 minutes of cardio per day during his contest prep, and he's like whiny, and he's like, I feel terrible, my strength is plummeting. Meanwhile, you give a female competitor 30 minutes of cardio per day, and they're like, can I do 15 minutes more? Hey, I set a personal record on bench press yesterday. You know what I mean? Like, it's vastly different reactions between those two. So it's like, just because, even though it's hard sometimes to lose fat, take pride in the fact that it also means you're preserving muscle probably better than the next guy or girl.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's funny, isn't it? Because you've got pros and cons on both sides. And I feel like females are, although more intricate and there's more variables, and sometimes they can be more challenging to coach. I feel like their mental ability to grind is far greater than most men. Even though sometimes men can be more simplistic and you say, hey, look, I want you to do this, this, and this. And the man's like, yep, done. Where sometimes females are like, but, and you're like, oh, hang on. But then when it comes down to like getting it done, just females have this, and I think there's some research backing this up, where their recovery, and I think it's relative to their body mass, is greater than males for what they are and their capacity to like grind through work and recover from it. And I don't know, my hunch is, and I don't know if there's research to back this up, but that because they're designed to give birth, they are designed to take like an absolute beating, on their body. And I think a lot of the time they have what I like to call like this resilience, which is quite profound. And I think to kind of put these two things together, when we were going back towards, look at these populations around the world, whether it's black or otherwise, people who have, this metabolism where they've got to get on, super low calories to get them shredded. And it's like, well, if we think about it, the body doesn't know we're trying to jump on stage. It just thinks we're starving it to death. If anything, that's a genetically resilient trait, which is quite a positive one, because it means, if anything, that you would survive with less food. So it's actually a good thing. But in the scenario of the modern world, we think it's a bad thing because, for all we know, we just want to get on stage and take some awesome photos and get a trophy. But really, the body doesn't care about that. It doesn't even know. It just is like, shit, like, you're trying to kill me. I'm going to conserve as much energy as I can until you give me food. Sorry, go on.
I think one of the mechanistic reasons that also women tend to not lose as much muscle mass during their, they do, obviously recover. A lot of research shows they recover a little bit better, but I also think they don't lose muscle mass the way men do, is because their strength or their muscle tissue is not as testosterone dependent.
Yes.
Obviously, we see like when men, they prep during the last like 8 weeks, usually testosterone just like plummets. Most men, natural competitors, are going to have testosterone of the level of about average 70-year-old man. And so it's like, it makes sense. Their body's like, we got to get this muscle, out of here. Whereas women, a drop in testosterone isn't a great difference for them. So it's like their muscle tissue wasn't dependent on that testosterone in the first place. So a little bit of drop isn't going to be a problem. I guess the difference that I see though is like, whereas, so after a prep, men take a little while to get testosterone back on track. Women don't. But as you said, like, their bodies need to give birth. So it's like, women's in my, so I sometimes have my clients do blood work, and I notice trends. Women's thyroid hormones tend to take a little longer to get back on track post competition. Whereas like, sometimes it can take sometimes it can take men several months to get back on track. It's like men's bodies are saying, hey, let's not procreate right now. Let's, get stronger first here. Whereas women's, it's like, hey, let's not lose any weight here for a while. You know what I mean? So I think it's also a difference. Whereas like, a lot of women that want to, they put on weight after a show and they want to turn around and diet again with a couple months, and it just doesn't work the same way. It's because their thyroid hormones tend to not recover the same way that men's do. So yeah, it's very interesting seeing those gender differences between males and females, because there are absolutely quite a few of them hormonally, and not just hormonally but mentally too, which then I think impacts physiology as well.
Yeah, and that was the next question I wanted to dive into, but I know there's so much, and again we're almost at time, and but there's so much more to talk about, and perhaps we'll have to do again another part 2 to the series, because there's so many little intricacies and there's so many more questions that I have that I think would benefit from the listeners and coaches about talking about those differences between male, female, different populations, different athletes. But before we go, one more question before I get into my series of mini questions before the end is, and I think I'd be doing myself a disservice to not mention this, is when we're going back to loading and carb loading specifically between enhanced and natural athletes. I know that from the enhanced athletes I've spoke to, they talk to me sometimes about the ridiculous amount of carbohydrates they've got in. I would really like to know about what foods you use for someone who has got to have an obscene amount of carbohydrates to assimilate and actually be able to get that food in without making themselves sick, and actually digesting and metabolizing the carbohydrate and effectively putting it into glycogen. But then also kind of displaying the myth about your rapid backload, because I know people are like, oh, Cliff, he's a rapid backload guy. And you're kind of like, no, this is one technique that I've used. It's not for everybody. So I feel like you need to kind of say your piece on that. But perhaps, feel free to kind of, I guess, kind of streamline it in respect to time. But say what you've got to say. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So when it comes to carbohydrate foods, because the way I view it, each person has such unique needs in terms of carbohydrate amount. If we're going to look at just the basics of carbohydrate amount, sodium, and potassium. All right. So when I look at carbohydrate foods, I break it down into I'll have potassium-rich carbohydrates, which would be some form of potato usually, sweet potato, red potato, white potato. So it has potassium and it has no sodium. And then I'll go into sodium and potassium devoid foods, usually rice cakes and like jasmine rice, like white rice. So I'll use that. And then we're going to look at, then I'll have like also liquid carbohydrates. I'll use Gatorade if I want something with sodium and potassium. And I'll use like pure dextrose if I want something devoid of sodium and potassium. Oh, and then I'm sorry. And then also use plain Cheerios a lot of times for a couple reasons. One, that's the food that I use if I want smaller amounts of both sodium and potassium. And so that has a little bit of both in there. And it's also a good travel food. Like competitors can put it in baggies very easily and then just eat it. So I tend to like to use those foods. It doesn't mean I never break out of those foods, but those foods are my go-to foods because they're pretty light. You know what I mean? Like Cheerios go down real easy when you've been in prep. You know, white rice, jasmine rice goes down really easily. Potatoes are a little heavier, but you don't need tons of potatoes. And so I use those tools sort of at my disposal to hit whatever ratios I want to hit with sodium and potassium. And I have like different foods for different purposes, you know, some potassium rich, some sodium rich, some devoid completely. And, but you're generally going to find if you need a big carb load, that's something that's easier on the stomach. The easiest ones on the stomach are going to be like rice cakes and jasmine rice because they're devoid of sodium and potassium. So they're going to be a little bit easier to get down in massive amounts. And then to your second question, yes, the rapid backload, it is a tech. For those that don't know, the rapid backload is a peaking technique where I load someone up in the 24 to 36 hours before stage. And it sounds super, from the outside, when people hear this, they're like, man, that sounds amazing. You know, this guy's eating 1,000 carbs the day before the show, and it sounds really exciting and really sexy. And
marketable.
I use it because it's effective, but it is far from the only peaking method that I use. There's generally about 6 different peaking methods that I use. Sometimes I'll kind of combine 2 of those to create something kind of new. But you know, I think that it's just a tool in the tool bag of peaking approach. And so I think one of the things when it comes to peaking is like try not to be tied down to any one specific method. I had somebody compete, not in 2019, but 2018. His name is Andy Southard, and he ended up winning Masters. He took second at the World Championships in the IPE, and he won the Masters World Championships just before that. He did like 3 shows that year. We did 3 different peaking approaches for each show. Just because of what we were seeing, we thought, we can maybe get a little bit better if we try this approach. And sometimes with back-to-back shows, I'll peak someone differently the first time than the second. So I guess what I'm saying is don't be married to any one approach because you can really learn a lot by trying different approaches with people. And I always say the more chances I get to peak somebody, the better I get at it because the more I learn about their body and what works.
100%. Yeah, no, thanks, Cliff. Thanks. And thanks for putting some sort of caveats around those two questions, because I know there's a lot more that can be said there. And as you said, with the foods, they're not magic, but it's nice to have those silos of foods in the first part of the question to be able to go through, because it's like, hey, you know what? These are some go-tos. They're not magic, but they generally work because of, you said, like your sodium, your potassium, your glycogen, whatever it may be. And then obviously, like you said, but you're not married to them. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand this, because otherwise we're going to have a whole lot of people going out and buying Cheerios, and we're going to have a new sponsor. And then, and then secondly, I think with the rapid backload, again, great that and then that's why I kind of wanted to mention it, because I know a lot of people, as you're very aware of, you spoke about with other podcasts, they talk about this rapid backload, and I think that's kind of who you are and what you do, but it's, you're not a one-trick pony. That's not what it is. And there's many other digressions. It's just obviously something that's been stereotyped because you've had, success with it. So I guess to kind of wrap up, Cliff, I have a couple of real just fiery quick questions before we go, and then the last one that I ask all my guests. So these ones are a bit lighthearted, a bit fun, whatever comes to mind. So the first question would be, if you could choose a superpower, what would it be and why?
Oh boy. I think that super speed would be pretty interesting. Because I think with super speed, the applications are pretty limitless. And if I say super speed, I'm talking like the Flash. And I know that sounds a little bit different, but I think the applications are pretty, you can go sports with that. You can go helping people, you know what I mean? Like the applications are so limitless with super speed.
That would be very, very cool indeed. All right. I guess my second one is, if you could invite 3 people around a table to have a chat with, dead or alive, who would they be? Top of your head.
I would go with Albert Einstein, Milton Friedman, and I'm going to go Thomas Sowell also. Okay. Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell are kind of in the same camp, but I would like to hear the interaction between those two, because they'd probably have better banter back and forth than I would with any one of them, if that makes sense.
I see. Yeah, no, interesting. Very cool indeed. And my last question, nice and easy as well. What's your favorite food?
My favorite food, it's pretty basic. I love pizza, but I guess if I'm going to put a twist on it, I tend to like cheap pizzas. My mom tells me that when she was pregnant with me, she would eat like these like frozen $2 pizzas, and she would eat like one every other day. And I think as a result, I like cheap pizza to this day. I know it's like awful, but like cheap frozen pizza, I still love them.
Why not, mate? Simple pleasures. And that's a very different one. There's a different answer. I've not had that one before. And to my last question, Cliff, which is a bit more of a serious note, and I ask all my guests, can you identify a time in your life or a fear specifically that you've had, or what the fear was and how you overcame it? It can be big, small, past, present.
I'll keep it within the bodybuilding realm. I guess that between my genetics, I'm not really built for bodybuilding. Anybody who's ever seen me in person will see that I look more like a runner than a bodybuilder. And then combined with the fact that when I started coaching, people weren't coaching that didn't have educational backgrounds.
Yes.
And there was definitely a feeling of like imposter syndrome, where I was like, I don't really know if I belong here. And so I think over time, I had to convince myself that I belonged, both competing and in coaching, and just remind myself that what I know is valid regardless of how I learned it. You know what I mean? The information that I got and the information that I have is still valid regardless of whether it was taught to me by a teacher or taught to myself online. It's still every bit as good.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's a very relevant way to finish what's been an absolutely interesting conversation, Cliff. I know I've really enjoyed it, and I've definitely learned quite a few things. And again, there's a lot more we could have chatted about, and I'm sure perhaps we can line up another one and perhaps divulge some more information. And I just want to say thank you again for being so generous with your time and the work that you do. I think it's phenomenal, again, being someone who's kind of pioneering and breaking the mold a little bit. Before you go, where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you do, social media, website, etc.?
Awesome. Yeah. So my website is teamwilsonbb.com. And then my Instagram is CWTeamWilson. And those are the two best places to really get a hold of me. You know, like on my website, that's where people can like apply for coaching and, see like what I have on there. And then on my Instagram, I try to put up, something at least every other day, a new post, an educational post. So those would be the best two places.
Fantastic.
And
I'll make sure.
I really appreciate you having me on here. This is a great conversation.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure, Cliff. Always great to chat with like-minded people. And I'll make sure I put those links in the show notes below as always. And, for everyone watching wherever you are in the world, make sure, again, if you want to hear more of what we talk about, make sure you chime in, give us a rating and review on iTunes and Spotify. And feel free to reach out because it's a great community where we're trying to spread some really, as we say, raw knowledge. But as always, in the meantime, guys, until next week, stay fearless.